The woman collapsed at my fence, her torn habit revealing scars I had seen only once before. On men tortured for information they refused to give. 7 cigar burns, lined up on her arm like someone had been counting days. She looked up at me with green eyes I had not seen in 5 years. Eyes I had last seen through smoke and fire as 23 people burned alive. "Do you remember me, cowboy?" she whispered. "The man on the mountain." Behind her 3 miles east, a campfire burned. They were coming. But to understand why death was hunting us both, you need to know what happened 5 years before. The night that broke me. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine and coming snow across the peaks of the Rocky Mountains. On the porch of a weathered cabin perched high on Thunder Peak, an old man sat wrapped in a wool blanket, his white hair gleaming silver in the moonlight. Cole Hartford was 77 years old, and tonight, for the first time in decades, he would tell the story he had buried deeper than any grave. Beside him sat his grandson James, 19 years old, wearing the crisp new uniform of the United States Army. Tomorrow the boy would board a train heading east, then a ship heading to France where the Great War was grinding toward its bloody conclusion. This was their last night together, perhaps forever, and James had asked the question no one had ever dared to ask. He had pointed to the long, jagged scar running from his grandfather's elbow to his wrist and said, "Grandfather, you never told me how you got that scar." Cole looked at the mark on his arm, then looked at his grandson. The boy had his grandmother's eyes, green as spring leaves, green as the eyes of the woman who had changed everything. "You want to know about this scar," Cole said slowly. "Then I will tell you, but not just about the scar. I will tell you about the woman who changed my life, about the night I nearly lost my soul and how I found it again." He poured whiskey for both of them, the amber liquid catching the lamplight. 40 years ago I was 42 years old, older than you by more than 20 years, but younger in my soul than you could imagine. I lived alone on this very mountain, believing I did not deserve to walk among other men. Then one day someone appeared, and everything changed. Cole settled deeper into his chair, his eyes growing distant as memory carried him back across 4 decades. To understand what happened in the autumn of 1878, you must first understand what happened 5 years before. You must understand the night that broke me. The old man's voice grew heavy with sorrow. The night of the massacre, November 1873. The snow fell softly on St. Catherine's Mission, a small convent nestled on the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado Territory. The Sisters of Mercy had built this place 12 years earlier to serve the mining communities and families struggling to survive in the harsh mountain wilderness. That night, 23 souls slept within those walls. 8 nuns, including Mother Superior Claire, who was 58 years old and had dedicated 30 years of her life to serving God and His children. 7 orphans ranging from 4 to 12 years old children who had lost their parents to mining accidents or disease. 4 widows who had sought refuge after their husbands died, and 4 elderly people with nowhere else to go. They slept in peace, not knowing that death was riding toward them through the falling snow. Among those sleeping was Sister Margaret Stone, though everyone called her Maggie. At 20 years old, she was still a novice, not yet having taken her final vows. But Maggie was not like the other sisters. She stood 6 feet and 2 inches tall, with shoulders broad as a blacksmith's and arms corded with muscle from years of working at her father's forge before entering the convent. The children adored her. They called her Sister Giant, and she would lift them onto her shoulders 2 at a time, carrying them around the courtyard while they shrieked with laughter. Mother Claire saw something special in Maggie, a unique calling that combined gentleness of spirit with strength of body. On this particular evening, Maggie had been working late in the mission's small forge repairing horseshoes for the supply wagon. Sweat dampened her habit as she lifted the anvil with one hand to move it closer to the fire. A small boy, Tommy, age 6, watched from the doorway with wide eyes. "How do you do that, Sister Maggie?" he asked. She winked at him. "God made everyone different, Tommy. Some people are good at reading, some are good at singing. I am good at lifting heavy things." "Are you the strongest person in the world?" Maggie set down the anvil and knelt before him, her green eyes level with his. "Strength is not just in muscles, little one. The strongest person I know is Mother Claire. She has strength in her heart." I led those soldiers there. Even after 40 years, Cole's voice cracked on those words as he told his grandson the story. I was a scout for Fort Morrison, the best tracker in Colorado Territory. My father, Jacob Hartford, had been a mountain man of the old breed, a companion of Jim Bridger and Kit Carson. I grew up learning to read the land before I learned to read books. I could track a deer across bare stone where others saw nothing. I could tell the difference between the sound of wind and the sound of footsteps from half a mile away. I could survive 2 weeks in the snow with nothing but a knife and a blanket. Colonel Harrison used to say I could track a fish through a dried-up stream bed. When they needed someone to find a trail, they sent for Cole Hartford. That night, I led 12 cavalry and 6 infantry through the mountain passes following a map that a man named Edmund Blackwell had provided. Blackwell was a wealthy merchant in Silverton, respected, well-connected. He told the colonel that a band of outlaws had established a hideout in the mountains, a staging ground for raids on the mining camps. The map led to St. Catherine's Mission. I remember riding through the snow Old Thunder across my back. That was my Sharps rifle, 50 caliber, the most accurate long gun I had ever fired. My father gave it to me before he died, and I had never missed a shot that mattered. I wore a coat of deer hide and a beaver fur hat against the cold, but inside something was wrong. My gut was telling me something was not right about this mission. My father always said, "When your gut says no, you listen." But I was a soldier. I followed orders. When we crested the ridge above the mission, I saw the buildings below, and in that moment my heart knew what my mind refused to accept. "That is not an outlaw camp," I said to Lieutenant Morrison. "Those are mission buildings. That is a convent." But the colonel had given orders. The men were already moving. And then someone I never learned who fired the first shot. Chaos erupted. More shots. Torches thrown. Buildings catching fire. And through it all, the sounds that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Not the sounds of men fighting back. The sounds of women screaming, children crying, prayers being shouted in Latin as flames consumed the chapel. I rode down that hill faster than I had ever ridden, screaming for ceasefire until my throat was raw. But in the darkness and the confusion, no one heard or no one wanted to hear. The chapel was fully engulfed when I reached it. The heat hit me like a physical wall, pushing me back. But through the roar of the flames, I heard something that froze my blood. A child crying. I kicked in the door and plunged into hell. Smoke so thick I could not see my hand in front of my face. Flames crawling up the ancient wooden beams like living things. The air so hot it seared my lungs with every breath. And there in the corner, I saw them. A young woman, perhaps 20 years old, wearing the simple habit of a novice. But this was no ordinary nun. She was massive, tall as any man I had ever seen, with shoulders that strained against her habit and arms that looked capable of snapping timber. Brown hair the color of chestnuts, green eyes bright as emeralds even through the smoke. She was holding 2 children, a boy of about 6 and a girl of about 4, shielding them with her own body as a fallen beam pinned her legs to the floor. She was not screaming. She was not crying. She was praying, her lips moving in Latin, her arms wrapped tight around those children. And when she looked up and saw me standing there, a soldier in the uniform of the men who had attacked, she did not beg for mercy. She did not plead for her life. She just looked at me with those green eyes, the eyes of someone who had already accepted death and kept praying. I did not think. I did not calculate the risks or consider my own safety. I just moved. The beam was massive oak, aged for decades, heavy as sin. I got my shoulder under it and pushed with everything I had. My back was to the flames, and I felt them licking at my coat, burning through the leather to the skin beneath. The pain was extraordinary, but I did not stop. I could not stop. The beam shifted an inch, then another. But it was not enough. I could not lift it alone. That was when the woman did something that changed everything. With a sound that was half prayer and half battle cry, she pushed. This woman, pinned beneath a beam that should have crushed her found strength, I had never seen in man or woman. The muscles in her arms bulged, her face contorted with effort, and the beam moved. Together we lifted it. I grabbed her by the arm, my hand barely fitting around her bicep, and pulled her free. Then I shoved her toward the door. "Go!" I shouted. "Get them out!" But she would not leave without the children. She scooped up the little girl with one arm. I grabbed the boy, and together we ran through the flames as the roof began to collapse behind us. We made it outside just as the chapel fell in on itself, sending a tower of sparks into the night sky. I set the boy down and turned back, because I knew there were others still inside, other buildings, others I might save. I went back 3 more times, into the dormitory where I pulled old Martha Hindress from her bed as flames consumed the room around her, into the orphanage wing where I searched room after room, calling out, finding no one still alive. The 3rd time I almost did not make it out. A wall collapsed and I felt something strike my head. When I came to, I was lying in the snow 20 feet from the burning building, and one of the soldiers was pouring water on my smoldering coat. 17 people died that night, including Mother Superior Claire, who was shot while standing in front of the children's dormitory trying to protect them with nothing but her body and her faith. I saved 4 people. The novice whose name I learned was Margaret Stone, though everyone called her Maggie. The 2 orphans, Tommy and little Mary. And old Martha Hindress, 4 out of 23. I have carried the weight of those 19 souls every day of my life since. But there is something else I must tell you about that night. Something that happened in the moments after I pulled Maggie from the flames. As I laid her down in the snow, as I turned to go back into the fire, she grabbed my hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong, stronger than any woman I had ever touched, stronger than most men. And she said in a voice raw from smoke, "You are crying." I had not realized it. Tears were streaming down my face, freezing in the cold air. Cole Hartford, the hardest man in Colorado Territory, the scout who had faced down grizzly bears and survived blizzards and tracked outlaws through impossible terrain. I was weeping like a child. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she passed out. But just before she lost consciousness, I heard what I said to Lieutenant Morrison. I did not know I was going to say it until the words left my mouth. "Blackwell," I said. "Edmund Blackwell gave us this information. He will answer for this." I did not know then how right I was, and I did not know that Margaret Stone heard those words and remembered them and carried them with her through 5 years of hell. After that night I could not continue as I had been. I resigned my commission, turned in my uniform, and walked away from everything I had known. I came up here to Thunder Peak. I built this cabin with my own hands, using skills my father taught me. I thought that if I went high enough, far enough from other people, I could escape the memories. I was wrong. The first year was the worst. Every night I dreamed of fire. I heard the screaming. I saw the faces of the dead, especially one little girl, 8 years old, whose body I found in the ruins of the orphanage the next morning. She was still clutching a rag doll and her eyes were open, staring at nothing. I tried to die 3 times that year. James made a sound of shock, but Cole held up his hand. The first time I put Old Thunder in my mouth and placed my finger on the trigger. I sat like that for an hour, arguing with myself. What stopped me was the memory of Maggie's eyes, green and clear, looking at me through the smoke. The memory of her voice saying, "Thank you." If I died, who would remember that I had done one thing right? The second time I stood on the edge of a cliff, 500 feet of nothing below me. One step, and it would be over. But as I stood there, I saw an eagle teaching its young to fly, the mother circling patiently while the fledgling tried again and again. And I thought of Tommy and little Mary, the 2 children I had saved. Were they happy somewhere? Were they alive? I stepped back from the edge. The third time, I simply drank whiskey. I had distilled myself harsh as lye. I drank until my body shut down, until I lay on this floor for 3 days, vomiting blood, burning with fever, hallucinating conversations with the dead. But my body refused to die. My father used to say the Hartfords were stubborn as mules even with the Grim Reaper. He was right. After that third time I stopped trying to die. But I did not really live either. I existed. I hunted. I trapped. I survived. People in the settlements below started calling me the ghost of Thunder Peak. They would see me once or twice a year when I came down to trade furs for ammunition and salt. And they would whisper about the wild man who lived alone in the high country. 5 years passed like that. 5 years of silence. 5 years of routine. 5 years of trying to bury the memories under work and whiskey. Wake before dawn. Check the trap lines. Return. Chop wood. Repair the cabin. Hunt or fish. Eat alone. Drink alone. Sleep alone. Dream of fire. My hair turned white when I was 38 years old. Not gray-white as snow from the stress and the grief. My face weathered like canyon stone. My eyes took on the look of a man who had seen too much and wanted to see nothing more. And then, on a September afternoon in 1878, everything changed. I was working on the fence around my trap storage about 200 yards from the cabin. The aspens were turning gold, and the air had that clean, sharp smell that means snow is not far away. It was a peaceful afternoon, the kind I had learned to appreciate in my solitude. And then my instincts woke up like a boom hearing a distant footstep. The birds had stopped singing. The squirrels had vanished. The wind shifted, carrying a scent that did not belong. Sweat, blood, exhaustion. Human. I looked up at the eastern ridge and I saw a figure standing there motionless, silhouetted against the pale autumn sky. My hand moved to the pistol at my hip before my brain had finished processing what my eyes were seeing. I had not had a visitor in 5 years. People did not come to Thunder Peak. People did not find this place unless they were looking for it. The figure began to descend. Slow at first, then stumbling each step an obvious effort. By the time the person was halfway down the slope, I could see more details. A woman wearing black. The black habit of a nun, though it was torn and filthy, the veil ripped away to reveal dark hair matted with dirt and sweat. Her dress was shredded from the knee down, and her legs were covered in scratches and bruises. She moved like someone running on nothing but willpower, every step a small victory against collapse. But what struck me most was her size. This was no ordinary woman. She stood tall as any man, maybe taller, with shoulders that would make a lumberjack envious. Even from a distance, even in her weakened state, she moved with a power that was unmistakable. She reached the fence and grabbed the top rail to steady herself. The fence creaked under the weight. Her face was gaunt cheekbones standing out sharp under skin weathered by sun and wind. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her eyes were shadowed by exhaustion and pain. But the eyes themselves, the eyes were green, clear green, bright as emeralds, burning with a fierce determination that I recognized. I knew those eyes. I had seen them through smoke and fire 5 years before. The woman opened her mouth and her voice came out as a ragged whisper. "Do you remember me, cowboy? The man on the mountain?" My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. Memories were crashing over me like waves in a storm. "I am Margaret," she continued. "Sister Margaret Stone, St. Catherine's Mission. 5 years ago you pulled me from the fire." I stood frozen, my hand still on my pistol, my mind struggling to reconcile the image before me with the memory I had carried for 5 years. The novice, the girl who had held those children, the green eyes that had looked at me through the smoke, the voice that had said thank you before unconsciousness took her. "I remember," I said. My voice sounded like gravel. I had barely spoken in months. How did you find this place? Why are you here?" "I walked," she said. 9 days, following the direction of the mountains, following what I remembered about which way you rode that night. 9 days. The nearest settlement was 30 miles away over some of the roughest terrain in Colorado, a woman alone on foot without supplies. "They are hunting me," Maggie said. "Edmund's men. They want—" Her knees buckled before she could finish the sentence. I caught her before she hit the ground. She weighed almost nothing in my arms, light as a child despite her size, as if she had not eaten in a week, As I lifted her, I saw the wounds, burn marks on her forearm. Not random burns, but deliberate ones, circular, the size of cigar tips. 7 of them lined up in a row like someone had been counting days. A deep cut on her thigh, crudely stitched with rough thread, the skin around it red and swollen with infection. Bruises around her throat in the shape of fingers. Someone had strangled her more than once. And when I shifted her in my arms, her torn habit fell away from her back, and I saw the scars. At least 20 marks where someone had whipped her. Some old and white, some fresh and red. Someone had tortured this woman systematically for a long time. I carried her into the cabin and laid her on my bed. My bed, which I had not shared with another soul in 5 years. The sheets still smelled of smoke and wilderness, but they were clean and they were dry, and they were better than whatever hell she had escaped from. I worked through the night. I boiled water and brewed her tea from yarrow and wild mint medicines my father had taught me to make for fever and exhaustion. I washed her wounds with whiskey, and she hissed through her teeth at the sting, but did not cry out. I cleaned the infected cut on her thigh, squeezing out the pus, removing the crude stitches and sewing it closed again with thread I had boiled for cleanliness. When I squeezed the wound, she gripped the bed frame and the wood cracked under her strength. Even half dead from starvation and torture, her power was extraordinary. I did not ask questions. I did not speak except to tell her to drink or to warn her before something would hurt. I just worked the way I had been working alone for 5 years, except now my work had a purpose beyond mere survival. She drifted in and out of consciousness, calling out names in her delirium. Mother Claire, Tommy, Mary. Once she opened her eyes and looked at me with an expression of wonder. "Am I dead?" she whispered. "Is this heaven?" "No," I told her. "You are alive. You are safe." She grabbed my hand then the same way she had grabbed it 5 years before in the snow outside the burning chapel. Her grip was still strong even now. "You are the only one," she whispered. "The only one who ever saved me." Then she slept, and I sat beside her bed watching her breathe, feeling something stir in my chest that I had thought was dead forever. The next morning Maggie was awake and lucid. The fever had broken, and though she was still weak, the fire was back in her eyes. I propped her up with blankets and gave her water, then sat back and waited for her to speak. After the massacre, she began, her voice steady but soft. "I was taken to a hospital in Denver. Tommy and little Mary were adopted by a family in Kansas. I never saw them again." She paused, collecting herself. "The church decided not to rebuild St. Catherine's. They said the area was too dangerous. I was transferred to St. Clare's Convent in Denver to continue my novitiate. 3 years later, I took my vows and became Sister Margaret." She looked down at her hands at the scars and calluses that had not been there when she was a young novice. "I thought if I dedicated myself completely to God, I could forget what happened. I could forget the screaming, the fire, the faces of the dead. I could find peace. But Edmund Blackwell would not let me forget." The name hit me like a physical blow. Edmund Blackwell, the man who had given the false intelligence, the man I had blamed in that moment of rage on the night of the massacre. 6 months ago, Maggie continued, Edmund came to St. Clare's. He presented himself as a benefactor, donated $500 to our charity fund. Mother Superior Judith was very grateful, but I recognized him. Her hands tightened into fists. His face had haunted me for 5 years, and he recognized me. Maggie's voice dropped lower. That night he came to my cell. He told me I was the last witness. Everyone else who survived that night had died. Tommy, little Mary, old Martha, even 4 of the soldiers who were there, all dead in accidents over the past 5 years. I felt the blood drain from my face. Tommy and Mary, the children I had saved, the only thing that had given me hope in my darkest moments, dead. "A fire in Kansas," Maggie said quietly. 2 years after the massacre, the whole family died. The official report said it was an accident with a lantern. "Edmund killed them," I said. The words came out flat and dead. "He killed everyone who knew the truth. Everyone except me." and accept you." I stood up and walked to the window, my back to her. My shoulders were shaking, though I did not know if it was with grief or rage. For 5 years I had lived with the hope that at least some good had come from that terrible night, that Tommy was growing into a fine young man somewhere, that little Mary was happy with a loving family, that my actions had mattered. Now even that hope was ashes. Maggie continued speaking behind me. "Edmund kidnapped me from the convent. He told Mother Superior Judith that he was taking me to a new charitable institution he was founding. She believed him. When I tried to tell her the truth when I said he was a murderer, she thought I had gone mad from trauma." She paused, and I heard her take a shaking breath. 4 months, Cole. He kept me in a cellar beneath his house in Silverton. Every week he would come down and ask me questions. What did I remember about that night? Had I told anyone? Did I know where you were? And every time I did not give him what he wanted? She did not need to finish. The burns on her arm, the scars on her back, the story they told was clear enough. 2 weeks ago I escaped. One of the guards got drunk and forgot to lock my cell. I ran. I did not know where to go, but I remembered the direction you rode that night, northwest toward the mountains. I thought if anyone in the world could protect me, it was you." I turned back to face her. "How did you know I was still alive? I could have died years ago." "I did not know," she admitted. "I only hoped, and I prayed. Mother Claire used to say that God provides for those with faith. I had to believe she was right. Mother Claire talked about me before she died. Yes, I was with her in those last moments after she was shot. She was bleeding, dying, and she took my hand and said, 'If you ever need help, find the scout, the one who was crying. He has a conscience. That is rare in this world.' I turned away again because I did not want her to see the moisture in my eyes. 'She believed in you,' Maggie said, 'and I believe in her.'" We sat in silence for a long moment. Then Maggie reached into the remains of her habit and pulled out a small object, a leather-bound notebook worn and stained. "I took this from Edmund's study when I escaped," she said. "It contains everything. Names of people he has bribed, records of payments to judges and sheriffs, and detailed plans about the night of the massacre." I took the notebook and began to flip through the pages. What I saw made my blood run cold. November 1873. Payment to Colonel Harrison, $200 for cooperation. Lieutenant Morrison, $50. False intelligence report prepared. Target St. Catherine's Mission. Objective clear the land for mining claim. Beneath that, a silver assay report. St. Catherine's property estimated value $2 million plus. I looked up at Maggie. He did not make a mistake with the intelligence. He did it deliberately. "The mission sat on one of the richest silver deposits in Colorado," Maggie said. "But the land belonged to the church protected by a federal charter from 1850. Edmund could not buy it. He could not claim it. So he arranged for the mission to be destroyed by outlaws. 3 months after the massacre, Edmund bought the entire property for $200. The mine on that land now earns him $50,000 a year. 23 people died for silver. 23 people died for one man's greed. And now he wants to kill both of us to protect his secret," Maggie said. "I heard his men talking before I escaped. They know you are the last threat to him. You are the only one who knew the intelligence was false. If you ever figure out what really happened, if you ever find proof, his empire collapses." I looked at the notebook in my hands. "This is the proof." "Yes, and he knows I have it. He will not stop hunting me until he gets it back." I walked to the window and looked out at the ridge where Maggie had appeared the day before. Somewhere out there, Edmund's hunters were coming. Men who killed for money, who would not hesitate to murder a nun and a hermit to protect their employer's secrets. For 5 years I had hidden from the world. For 5 years I had run from my guilt and my grief. For 5 years I had existed without really living. But looking at Maggie, this woman who had walked 9 days through the wilderness to find me, who had survived torture and imprisonment, and emerged with evidence that could bring down a monster, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Purpose. "He will come," I said. "Edmund will send men, and they will find this place eventually. No one can hide forever." "I know," Maggie said. "I did not come here expecting to survive. I came because you were the only person who ever chose to save me. If I have to die, I wanted it to be in a place I chose, with someone I chose." I turned to face her. "You are not going to die. No one dies on my watch. That is a promise." She smiled, then the first real smile I had seen on her face. It transformed her, making her look younger, softer, despite all the scars and suffering. "Mother Claire was right about you," she said. "You are a good man." "I am not," I replied, "but I am trying to be." That night I slept on the porch, giving Maggie the bed. It was cold, but I had slept in worse conditions, and she needed to feel safe. She needed to know that I would not take advantage of her vulnerability. The next morning, I climbed to the highest point near the cabin, a rocky outcrop that gave me a view for miles in every direction. I scanned the horizon with my telescope, looking for any sign of pursuit. And I found it. To the east, perhaps 3 miles away, a thin column of smoke rose into the morning air. Not a wildfire. Too small, too controlled. A campfire. Someone had made camp on the approach to my territory. I studied the smoke for a long time, calculating distance and direction. Then I returned to the cabin. "They are here," I told Maggie. "About 3 miles east. They have made camp." Her face went pale, but she did not panic. "How many? I do not know yet, but Edmund does not do things halfway. There could be 6. There could be a dozen. What do we do?" For a moment I considered our options. We could run. I knew these mountains better than anyone alive. We could disappear into the wilderness, stay ahead of the hunters for weeks, maybe months, but running would not solve anything. Edmund would keep sending men. He had the money and the patience to hunt us forever, and running would mean giving up any hope of justice for the 23 people who died. "We prepare," I said, "and I find allies. Allies up here." There is someone, a man I have not spoken to in 5 years. His name is Henry Whitehawk. He is Cheyenne. Used to be a scout like me. We worked together for 3 years before the massacre. When he heard what happened at St. Catherine's, he called me a murderer and walked away. But if he knows the truth, if he knows Edmund was behind it all, he might help. Why would he care? Because his sister Rachel used to go to the mission twice a week to learn reading. If she had been there that night, Maggie's eyes widened. She might have died too. Exactly. Henry has no love for me, but he might have hatred enough for Edmund. I spent the rest of that day teaching Maggie to shoot. She had never held a gun before. She said it was not something nuns did, but she learned quickly. Her hands were steady, her aim improving with each practice shot. "Nuns do not kill," I reminded her as she reloaded. "I am not a nun anymore," she replied. "I am Margaret Stone, and Margaret Stone is going to survive." That night after the sun went down, I prepared to leave. "I will be back within 2 days," I told her. "If anyone comes through that door who is not me, you shoot first and ask questions later. Understood?" "Understood." I hesitated at the door. There was something in me that did not want to leave her, something beyond tactical concern. But I pushed it down. There was no room for such feelings. Not now. Maybe not ever. "I will come back," I said. "That is a promise." "I believe you," she replied. "You are the only one who ever kept a promise to me." I slipped out into the darkness and began the long journey to White River Valley, where Henry Whitehawk made his home among the Cheyenne. Behind me in the cabin on Thunder Peak, a woman with green eyes sat with a pistol in her lap, waiting for dawn. And ahead of me, somewhere in the darkness, death was waiting too. The night swallowed me whole as I became the ghost they called me once more. I moved through the night forest like a ghost, which was fitting since that was what the settlers called me, the ghost of Thunder Peak. For 5 years I had earned that name, living in silence and solitude, invisible to the world. Now that skill would keep me alive. I circled wide around the enemy camp, keeping a mile of rough terrain between us. Even so, I stopped twice to observe them through my telescope. 7 men sat around the fire. 7 hard-faced men with Winchester rifles and the look of professionals. But it was the eighth figure that made my blood chill. I recognized him from stories and descriptions. Silas Drake, the bounty hunter with the scar across his left cheek running from his eye to his jaw. In the past 10 years, Drake had killed at least 15 men, and no one he hunted had ever escaped. If Edmund had hired Drake, it meant he wanted us dead, not captured. I continued on, moving faster now. The Cheyenne camp was 12 miles away across some of the roughest country in Colorado. I reached it just as the eastern sky began to lighten. I did not enter the camp. That would have been dangerous and disrespectful. Instead, I climbed to a high rock overlooking the valley and waited. Henry Whitehawk appeared half an hour after sunrise, riding a black horse carrying a bow and a rifle. He was 40 years old, tall and broad-shouldered with copper skin and long black hair. His eyes were sharp as an eagle's, and when he saw me sitting on the rock, they filled with cold fury. "Cole Hartford," he said, "I thought you were dead." "Nearly was, several times. But I have something to tell you, and after you hear it, you can decide whether to kill me or help me." Henry dismounted and stood with his hand on his rifle. "Talk, but make it fast." I told him everything. About Edmund, about the false intelligence, about the massacre being deliberately planned so that Edmund could steal the mission's land. About Maggie and the notebook and the years of murders to cover up the truth. About how Rachel came to the mission twice a week and could have died that night if she had been there at the wrong time. Henry listened without expression. But when I mentioned his sister, when I said that she had been at the mission twice a week and could have died, his hand tightened on his rifle until his knuckles went white. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "I have hated you for 5 years, he finally said. "Every night I prayed that you would die in pain." "I know. But there is something you do not know." I waited. Colonel Victor Ashford, the commanding officer that night. He did not die in a riding accident 3 years ago. My heart stopped. I thought all the soldiers were dead. I found him 3 years ago wandering in the forest, half-starved and completely mad. He has no memory, cannot speak. We took him in because he was no longer a threat. We call him Lost Walker. He lives in our village, cared for by our women. If there was a way to make him remember, I said slowly, he could testify. He received direct orders from Edmund. If his memory returns, he becomes a witness. Henry nodded slowly. "I understand now why you came. You want my help." "I need your help. Maggie and I are outnumbered. Edmund has sent Silas Drake and at least 7 men, probably more coming. We cannot win alone." "And what makes you think I will help the man I have cursed for 5 years?" "Because this is not about me," I said. "This is about the 23 people who died. This is about Rachel, who could have been one of them. This is about Edmund, who has been stealing and killing with impunity while everyone else suffers. And this is about justice." Henry stared at me for a long time. Then he said, "Edmund has done more than harm the mission. He stole our land too. The Thunder Creek mine sits on ground that belonged to our people for generations. When we protested, he burned 3 of our lodges and killed 2 of our elders." "I did not know." "You lived on your mountain hiding from the world. Of course you did not know, but we remember. We have been waiting for a chance to strike back. Will you help me?" Henry turned and looked back toward his village. Then he looked at me again, and for the first time in 5 years, there was something other than hatred in his eyes. "Bring the woman and the notebook to our village. We will protect her while we plan, and I will gather warriors, not just Cheyenne, but Arapaho too. Edmund has made many enemies. It is time those enemies united." He mounted his horse and paused. "I will not forget what happened that night, Hartford, but I can see now that you were a tool, not the hand that wielded it. The true enemy is Edmund. If you help us destroy him, perhaps I can find a way to forgive." He rode away toward the village, and I began the long journey back to Thunder Peak. But even as I walked, even as hope began to kindle in my chest, I knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Because somewhere out there, Silas Drake was waiting, and the sun was rising on a day that would be written in blood. I returned to the cabin to find Maggie alive and unharmed but shaken. While I was gone, something had happened. She was sitting by the window with the pistol in her lap when I came through the door. The shadows under her eyes were darker than when I had left, but the fire in those green depths burned just as bright. "What happened?" I asked. "A man came, last night around 3 in the morning. Jonas Webb, he said his name was. One of Edmund's men." My hand went to my pistol. "Did he hurt you?" "No, I shot him first." I stared at her. "You shot him?" "In the shoulder. He kicked in the door, came in with his pistol drawn, told me Edmund wanted his property back. So I shot him." She looked at her hand, still trembling slightly. "He ran. But before he left, he said Edmund is bringing 20 more men, today or tomorrow. He said we are both dead." I examined the blood on the floor, the splintered door frame. Then I looked at Maggie, at this woman who had been a pacifist nun just months ago, who had now pulled a trigger to save herself. "You did right," I said. "He would have killed you or dragged you back." "I was a nun," she said quietly. "I swore never to harm another living soul." I knelt beside her. "You defended yourself. That is different. And you are right. You are not a nun anymore. You are a survivor. That is nothing to be ashamed of." I told her about Henry, about the alliance forming, about the plan to gather warriors and make a stand. And I told her about Victor Ashford. "Ashford?" she said, her eyes widening. "The colonel who commanded that night, I thought all the soldiers were dead." "He survived. But he lost his memory. Henry's people have been caring for him. If anyone can help him remember the truth, it might be you." We left the cabin that afternoon, traveling through the roughest terrain I knew. The journey took most of the day. I led Maggie up cliff faces and down ravines through thickets so dense we had to crawl on hands and knees. It was brutal travel, but it left no trail that even the best tracker could follow. At one point we came to a river crossing. The current was strong, the water deep and fast. "We will have to wade," I said. "The water is deep, but if we are careful—" Maggie looked at the river, then at me. Without a word, she reached down and lifted me. Just picked me up in her arms, like I weighed nothing, one arm under my knees, the other supporting my back. I was too shocked to protest as she waded into the current. The water came up to her waist, the current pushing hard, but she did not stumble. Her legs were like tree trunks, her balance perfect. She carried me across and set me down gently on the far bank. For a moment we just looked at each other. "I could have walked," I said. She smiled, the first time I had seen genuine amusement on her face. "Yes, but why waste time getting wet?" It was the first time she had smiled about her size, the first time she had used her strength without shame. Something had changed in her since she pulled that trigger. We reached White River Valley as the sun was setting. The village was beautiful. 30 lodges arranged in a great circle with smoke rising from each one like prayers ascending to heaven. The White River curved through the valley like a silver ribbon, and the mountains stood guard on 3 sides. But the peace was deceptive. Women and children were packing supplies, preparing to evacuate to caves deeper in the mountains. Warriors were checking weapons, sharpening knives, stringing bows. There was no panic, only the calm efficiency of people who had faced danger before and would face it again. Henry met us at the edge of the village. His expression was unreadable as he studied Maggie, taking in her height, her broad shoulders, the power evident even in her weakened state. "This is the woman?" he asked. "Sister Margaret Stone," I said. "She survived the massacre, survived Edmund's prison, and walked 9 days through the wilderness to find me. She has more courage than most men I have known." Henry nodded slowly. "Then welcome, Margaret Stone. You are safe here, for now." He led us to the council lodge where several men were already gathered. Joseph Greywolf, a veteran warrior in his mid-40s with a scar running from his temple to his chin. Matthew Rivers, a young tracker of 28 who was said to be the best in the territory. Benjamin Britsky, the medicine man whose knowledge of healing herbs was matched only by his skill with the old pistol that had belonged to his grandfather. But it was the 4th person who drew my attention. A young woman, perhaps 28 years old, with long black hair and the lithe build of a deer. She moved with a grace that spoke of years of training, and she carried a bow that looked like it had been used in many battles. "Rachel Swift, dear," Henry said. "My sister." Rachel looked at Maggie and something flickered in her eyes, recognition followed by wonder. "I know you," she said softly. Maggie stared back, her brow furrowed. Then understanding dawned. "The girl who wanted to read books about horses," she whispered. "St. Catherine's. You came twice a week. You taught me to read." Rachel stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly. "You never looked at me like I was different. You never called me savage or heathen. You just taught me, like I was any other student." The two women embraced, and for a moment the years fell away. They were no longer a scarred survivor and a warrior preparing for battle. They were teacher and student reunited after 5 years of separation and sorrow. "I thought you were dead," Rachel said, pulling back to look at Maggie's face. "When I heard about the massacre, I wept for 3 days. Mother Claire, Sister Ruth, all the children. I thought everyone was gone." "Almost everyone," Maggie said, her voice heavy. "But not all. I survived, and I am here to make sure their deaths were not in vain." The council convened as night fell. Torches flickered in the lodge, casting dancing shadows on the hide walls. Henry stood at the center, his voice strong and clear. "Matthew has been watching the enemy camp. There are now 10 men, not 7. Jonas Webb returned with his wound and brought reinforcements. And there is more." He paused, letting the weight settle. "Edmund Blackwell himself is coming. He is bringing 20 more men. They will arrive tomorrow, maybe the day after." A murmur ran through the assembled warriors. 26 men against their dozen. The odds were not in their favor. Joseph spoke, his scarred face fierce in the torchlight. "Then we strike first. Hit them before they gather their full strength." "No," Henry said, holding up his hand. "Edmund is not a fool. He will be expecting more attacks. He will have doubled the sentries, set traps, prepared ambushes. If we go in blind, we will lose people." "So what do we do?" I asked. "We wait, we watch, we learn their patterns, and we prepare for the final battle." The plan came together through the night. 3 phases each designed to weaken the enemy before the final confrontation. Phase 1 would begin that very night. Matthew and Rachel would infiltrate the enemy camp under cover of darkness. They would not kill anyone, not yet. Instead, they would sabotage. Cut the horses' tethers so they would scatter at the first loud noise. Apply a poison oil to the saddles that would cause terrible itching and blisters. Leave a single arrow with a red cloth tied to it planted in the ground at the center of the camp. The arrow was a message, a declaration of war. Phase 2 would come the following night. I and Joseph would take positions on the ridges above the enemy camp and pick off sentries with long-range rifle fire. The goal was to eliminate 2 or 3 men and create fear. An enemy that could not sleep was an enemy already half defeated. Phase 3 would depend on what happened before. If the harassment worked, if enough men were killed or wounded or simply fled, they might be able to defeat Edmund's force in direct combat. If not, they would need to adapt. "What about Margaret?" Rachel asked. "She is the one they want most." "She stays here," Henry said. "Benjamin will watch over her. If everything fails, if we cannot stop Edmund, she will flee into the mountains with the women and children." Maggie stood up. "No." Everyone turned to look at her. "I will not hide while others fight for me," she said. "I am the reason Edmund is here. If anyone dies protecting me, I want to be there. I want to fight beside them." "You are not a warrior," Henry said, not unkindly. "You would be a liability in battle. I can shoot. Cole taught me. And I can do more than shoot. I can help with the wounded. I can carry ammunition. I can do something other than cower in a cave while brave people die in my name." I looked at her, at the steel in her green eyes, and knew there was no point arguing. "She stays with Benjamin," I said, "but not in the caves. Here in the village. If they break through our lines, she can fight alongside the last defenders." Henry considered this, then nodded. "Very well. But if I give the order to retreat, you go. No arguments." "Agreed," Maggie said. "But I do not plan on retreating." After the council ended, Henry led us to a small lodge at the edge of the village separate from the others. "There is someone you should see," he said. "Someone who might be able to help." Inside the lodge, an old man sat by a small fire staring into the flames. He was perhaps 57 years old, though he looked older. His hair was white and thin, his face gaunt. A terrible scar ran down the right side of his head, the mark of an injury that should have killed him. But it was his eyes that struck me most. Empty eyes, vacant, the eyes of a man whose mind had fled and never returned. "Colonel Ashford," I said softly. The old man did not respond. He did not even seem to hear. "We call him Lost Walker," Henry said. "We found him 3 years ago wandering in the forest, half dead from starvation and exposure. He had no memory, could not speak, did not know his own name. We took him in because he was no longer a threat, just a broken old man with nothing left." Maggie knelt before Victor, bringing her face level with his. She studied him for a long moment, then reached into her pouch and pulled out something small and silver. It was a cross on a chain, tarnished with age, but still recognizable. Mother Clare's cross. She had worn it around her neck for 30 years. Maggie had found it in the ashes of the chapel the morning after the massacre, clutched in the dead woman's hand. "Colonel Ashford," Maggie said gently, "do you remember this?" No response. The empty eyes stared through her, seeing nothing. "This belonged to Mother Superior Clare," Maggie continued. "She wore it the night your soldiers attacked the mission, the night she was shot trying to protect the children." Still nothing. But was there a flicker? Deep in those vacant eyes, a tremor like a stone dropped into still water. Maggie pressed on. "I was there that night. I was a novice, 20 years old. You led the soldiers who destroyed everything I loved. But someone led you. Someone gave you false orders. Someone told you it was an outlaw camp when it was really a convent full of innocent people." She held up the cross, letting the firelight catch the silver. "Do you remember, Colonel? Do you remember who gave those orders?" The silence stretched on. I was about to suggest we leave, that there was no point in disturbing this broken man further. Then Victor moved. His hand, trembling like a leaf in a windstorm, reached out toward the cross. His fingers touched the silver, and a sound escaped his lips. A word barely audible, the first word he had spoken in 3 years. "Claire." Maggie's breath caught. "Yes, Claire. Mother Superior Clare. She died that night. Do you remember?" Tears began to stream down Victor's weathered cheeks. His lips moved, forming words with terrible effort. "I gave the order. Edmund, Blackwell, said outlaws, staging ground. But I saw them." "What did you see?" "Women, children, nuns praying, and I could not stop it. The shooting had started. The fires were lit. I tried to countermand, but too late. Too late." His whole body shook with sobs. "I killed them. I killed them all." "No," Maggie said firmly. "Edmund killed them. He gave you false information. He planned the massacre so he could steal the mission's land. You were his weapon, Colonel, but he was the one who pulled the trigger." Victor looked at her, and for the first time there was something human in his eyes. Not the empty gaze of Lost Walker, but the anguished stare of a man confronting his sins. "I could have refused," he said. "Should have questioned. I knew something was wrong. My gut told me, but I followed orders anyway, because that is what soldiers do." He clutched the silver cross, pressing it against his heart. "I deserve to die, deserve worse than death." "What you deserve," Maggie said quietly, "is a chance to make it right. Edmund is coming here, coming to kill me, to destroy the evidence of his crimes. If you can testify against him, if you can tell the world what really happened, then maybe the people who died will finally have justice." She paused. "Testify before a court, before a judge. Tell them what Edmund told you. Tell them what you saw that night. Help us bring down the man who made you a murderer." Victor was silent for a long time. Then slowly he nodded. "I will speak. I will tell the truth. It will not bring them back. It will not wash the blood from my hands. But it is all I have left to give." That night, just after midnight, Matthew and Rachel slipped out of the village like shadows moving through the darkness toward the enemy camp. They carried no guns, only knives and coils of rope. The mission was simple: sabotage and intimidation, nothing more. They returned just before dawn, grinning despite their exhaustion. "It is done," Rachel reported. "We cut all the tethers on their horses. We coated every saddle with poison oak oil, and we left them a message they will not forget." "The arrow?" Henry asked. "Planted right in the center of their camp," Matthew said, "a foot from where Silas Drake was sleeping. He will wake up with it staring him in the face." Phase 1 was a complete success. The next day was tense. Scouts reported chaos in the enemy camp. Half the horses had scattered, and the men who had saddled up to chase them were now writhing in agony, their legs and backsides covered in blistering rashes. Silas was reportedly furious, screaming at his men, demanding to know how savages had infiltrated their perimeter without being seen. But he did not retreat. He sent word to Edmund that they needed reinforcements faster, that they were facing more than just a lone mountain man and a runaway nun. "He knows now," Henry said at the council meeting that afternoon. "He knows we are organized. He will be more careful tonight." "Then we must be more careful too," Joseph replied, "but we do not stop. The more we hurt them, the weaker they become." Phase 2 began after sunset. Joseph and I climbed to a ridge overlooking the enemy camp, a position that gave us clear lines of fire to the sentries. We had chosen our spots carefully, places where the muzzle flash would be hidden by rock formations, where the sound would echo and confuse. "2 targets," I said quietly. "The one by the north fire and the one patrolling the eastern perimeter. We fire simultaneously. They will not know how many of us there are or where we are shooting from." Joseph grunted his agreement. He was a man of few words, but deadly skills. We waited as the moon rose higher, watching the camp through our rifle sights. The sentries were alert, nervous after the previous night's infiltration. They kept looking over their shoulders, jumping at every sound. Good, I thought. Fear makes men careless. At the appointed signal, an owl hoot from Matthew hidden further down the ridge, both rifles fired. The 2 sentries dropped without a sound. One fell into the fire he had been guarding, and the flames caught his clothes, sending sparks into the air. The other crumpled against a tree dead before he hit the ground. The camp erupted in chaos. Men shouted, grabbed weapons, fired blindly into the darkness. But Joseph and I were already gone, slipping back into the night like ghosts. By the time the sun rose, the enemy had lost 2 more men and gained nothing but fear. But the news that arrived with the morning scouts was grim. "Edmund Blackwell is here," Matthew reported. "He arrived an hour before dawn with 22 men. They are making camp half a mile south of Silas's position." Henry's jaw tightened. 28 men now, against our dozen. The odds are not in our favor." "Then we change the odds," I said. "Hit them harder tonight." "No," Henry said, holding up his hand. "Edmund is not a fool. He will be expecting more attacks. He will have doubled the sentries, set traps, prepared ambushes. If we go in blind, we will lose people. So what do? We wait, we watch, we learn their patterns, and we prepare for the final battle." The waiting was the hardest part. For 3 days we observed the enemy camp, mapping patrol routes, counting supplies, identifying weaknesses. Edmund had brought professional killers, but he had also brought greed and impatience. His men were used to easy money, to targets who ran or surrendered. They were not prepared for an enemy who fought back from the shadows. Morale in the enemy camp was low. The itching from the poison saddles had spread to a dozen men. Food supplies were running short because no one wanted to venture out to hunt. And every night strange sounds echoed from the mountains. Drums, war cries, the howling of wolves that might or might not be human. Henry's psychological warfare was working, but Edmund was growing desperate, and desperate men were dangerous. On the 4th day, a lone rider approached the Cheyenne village under a white flag. It was Jonas Webb, his shoulder still bandaged from Maggie's bullet. "Edmund wants to talk," Webb said, his voice nervous. "He says if you give him the woman and the notebook, he will leave in peace. No more fighting, no more deaths." Henry looked at him with cold contempt. And what guarantee do we have that he will keep his word? His word as a gentleman. Joseph spat on the ground. The word of a man who massacres women and children for silver, that word is worth less than horse dung. Webb's face flushed. Look, I do not care what happens to the woman. But Edmund is not going to stop. He has money-men connections. You cannot win this fight. Give her up and at least some of you might survive. Henry's voice turned to ice. You may tell Edmund Blackwell this. The woman is under our protection. The notebook stays with us. If he wants them, he can come and take them. We will be waiting. Webb rode away, and everyone knew what his departure meant. The battle would come tomorrow. That night the village was quiet. Warriors made their final preparations, sharpening blades, checking weapons, saying prayers. The women and children had already left for the mountain caves, escorted by the elderly and the wounded. Only fighters remained. I found Maggie standing alone at the edge of the village, looking out at the darkness. You should be resting, I said. Tomorrow will be long. I know, but I cannot sleep. Too many thoughts. After a moment she spoke again. If tomorrow is the end, there is something I want you to know. I turned to look at her. In the moonlight her face was pale, her eyes luminous. I came here expecting to die, she continued. I thought finding you was the last thing I would do, and I made peace with that. But these past days being here fighting alongside you and these people, I have found something I thought I had lost forever. What is that hope? She smiled softly. For 5 years I believed that God had abandoned me, that the massacre, the torture, all the suffering, it meant that there was no justice in the world, no meaning to anything. But watching you, watching Henry and Rachel, and all the others risking their lives for a stranger, for a cause bigger than themselves, I believe again. I believe that good can win, that evil can be defeated. She took a breath. I also need you to know that if I do not survive tomorrow, I am grateful for everything, for pulling me from the fire 5 years ago, for opening your door when I appeared on your mountain, for being the man Mother Claire believed you could be. I was silent for a long moment. Then I reached out and took her hand. It was the first time I had voluntarily touched her since carrying her unconscious body into my cabin. You are going to survive, I said. We both are. That is a promise. You cannot promise that. I can promise to fight for it with everything I have. And I can promise that if anything happens to me, Henry and his people will get you to safety. The notebook will reach Denver. Edmund will be brought to justice even if I am not there to see it. Maggie squeezed my hand. I would rather you be there. So would I. We stood together in the darkness, two people who had been broken by the same tragedy and somehow found each other on the other side. No more words were needed. Sometimes presence was enough. The battle came with the sunrise. The enemy came with the sunrise, a wave of riders cresting the eastern ridge like a dark tide. Edmund Blackwell rode at the center on a white horse, his silver hair gleaming in the early light, his face twisted with rage and determination. Beside him was Silas Drake, rifle in hand, his scarred face wearing a predator's smile. 26 men against 50 defenders. Better odds than we had expected, but still dangerous. Edmund's men were professionals killers who had fought in range wars and border conflicts. The Cheyenne and Arapaho were brave, but many of them had never faced this kind of organized assault. Edmund raised his hand and the column halted just out of rifle range. His voice carried across the valley. Hartford, I know you are here. Send out the woman and the notebook, and I will let the savages live. This is your only chance. For a moment, there was no response. Then Henry's voice rang out. You are on Cheyenne land, Blackwell. You are not welcome here. Leave now or face the consequences. Edmund laughed a harsh, contemptuous sound. Consequences, from a bunch of half-naked savages and one washed-up scout. He turned to his men. Kill them all. Leave no one alive. The charge began. The first wave of riders galloped toward the village, firing as they came. The thunder of hooves mixed with gunfire and war cries in English and Cheyenne. Henry's defenders answered with a volley of rifle fire that dropped 3 men from their saddles, but the enemy kept coming, and the noise was deafening. I was positioned on high ground above the village, Old Thunder leveled, searching for Edmund. But the coward had fallen back behind his charging forces, protected by a ring of bodyguards. I shifted my target to Silas Drake, who was leading the charge with reckless bravery. The bounty hunter was zigzagging on his horse, making himself a difficult target. But I had been shooting since before Drake was born. I led the target, compensating for speed and distance, and squeezed the trigger. The shot took Drake in the thigh, spinning him off his horse. He hit the ground hard, but rolled to his feet, limping toward cover. Not a killing shot, but enough to take him out of the immediate fight. The first wave crashed against Henry's defensive line and broke like water on rocks. 6 more of Edmund's men fell, and the rest pulled back, regrouping for another charge. Joseph chose that moment to strike. His warriors emerged from the flanks, pouring fire into the retreating enemy. 3 more men dropped. The charge became a rout, with riders fleeing back toward Edmund's position, pursued by arrows and bullets. First blood went to the defenders, but everyone knew the fight was far from over. Edmund rallied his men for a second assault. This time he sent them on foot in a spread formation that made them harder to hit. They advanced slowly, using every rock and tree for cover, trading shots with the defenders. It was brutal, bloody work. For every enemy that fell, a Cheyenne or Arapaho warrior went down too. The medicine lodge filled with wounded men, and Maggie worked alongside Benjamin, bandaging wounds, stopping bleeding, doing everything she could to keep people alive. A young warrior barely older than James was brought in with a bullet in his chest. He looked at Maggie with fear in his eyes, and she held his hand while Benjamin tried to extract the bullet. "Tell my mother I was brave," the boy whispered. "You will tell her yourself," Maggie said. "You are going to be fine." But she saw Benjamin shake his head almost imperceptibly. The wound was too deep. There was nothing they could do. The boy died with Maggie holding his hand, the first person to die in her arms since Mother Claire. She did not cry. There was no time for tears. More wounded were coming, and they needed her. Outside, the battle raged on. The second assault was beaten back, but barely. Henry was wounded in the shoulder, still fighting despite the blood soaking his shirt. Matthew had taken an arrow through his arm but refused to leave the line. The third assault came just before noon, and this time Edmund himself led it. He charged forward on his white horse pistol, blazing, his silver hair flying in the wind. It was an act of desperate courage, or perhaps desperate madness, but it rallied his men for one final push. I saw my chance. I sighted down Old Thunder, placing the crosshairs directly on Edmund's chest. But before I could fire, someone else did. Victor Ashford had been waiting in a shallow ravine near the village's eastern edge. As Edmund rode past, the broken old colonel stood up, a pistol in his shaking hand. "Blackwell!" Edmund wheeled his horse, his face contorting in shock as he saw the man he had tried to have killed 3 years ago. "Ashford, you are supposed to be dead." "I remember everything," Victor shouted. "I remember what you told me. I remember the lies. I remember the orders to leave no witnesses. You made me a murderer, Blackwell. You used me to kill innocent people for silver." Edmund aimed his pistol at Victor. "You cannot prove anything. You are a madman. No one will believe you." Victor held up a piece of paper fluttering in the wind. "They will believe this. A signed confession. Everything I remember written down. It goes to the newspapers if I die. Your empire is finished either way." Edmund's face twisted with rage. He fired, and Victor staggered as the bullet struck his leg. But the old colonel did not fall. He fired back, and his shot hit Edmund's horse, sending both rider and mount crashing to the ground. In the chaos that followed, I lost my shot. By the time I had a clear line again, both men had disappeared into the swirling dust and smoke of the battlefield. The fighting devolved into a dozen individual struggles, warriors and gunmen locked in desperate combat. Rachel led a countercharge that drove the enemy back from the village's eastern edge. Joseph's flanking force swept in from the south, catching a group of Edmund's men in a deadly crossfire. And then suddenly, it was over. The surviving attackers broke and ran, fleeing back toward the hills. Some threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. Others simply ran, dropping everything in their haste to escape. Edmund was not among the runners. I found him at the center of the battlefield on his knees in the dust, Victor's pistol pressed against his head. "Kill me, then," Edmund snarled, "but it changes nothing. I have connections. I have money hidden in a dozen banks. My lawyers will destroy any evidence. You cannot touch me." Victor's hand was shaking, but his voice was steady. "I am not going to kill you, Blackwell. That would be too easy. You are going to stand trial. You are going to hear the names of everyone you murdered read aloud in court, and then you are going to hang while the whole world watches." Edmund's defiance crumbled. For the first time, real fear flickered in his eyes. "You cannot do this. I am Edmund Blackwell. I own judges. I own sheriffs." I stepped forward. Old thunder leveled at Edmund's chest. "Not anymore. Your men are dead or captured. The notebook is in our hands, and we have a written confession from the man you tried to kill." I looked at Victor, at the blood soaking his trouser leg, at the fierce determination in his eyes. "You did well, Colonel." Victor nodded slowly. "It does not balance the scales. Nothing can. But at least the truth will be known." We bound Edmund's hands and led him away. A fallen king stripped of his army and his arrogance. The battle was over, but the cost had been high. 12 Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors were dead. 20 more were wounded. The village was scarred by fire, and blood lodges destroyed sacred ground desecrated by violence. But they had won. Against all odds, against a professional force of killers led by one of the richest men in Colorado, they had won. Maggie emerged from the medicine lodge as the sun began to set, her hands still stained with blood from the wounded she had tended. She saw me standing at the edge of the village, looking out at the battlefield, and walked to join me. "Is it over?" she asked. "This part is," I said, turning to face her. Exhaustion lined every part of my body. "But there is still the trial, the testimony, the politics. Edmund is alive and in custody. He will face justice." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "I did not think I would survive today." "Neither did I. But here we are. Here we are." We stood together as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. Behind us, the wounded were being tended, and the dead were being prepared for burial. Ahead of us lay an uncertain future trials and testimony, the slow machinery of justice grinding toward a conclusion that was not guaranteed. But for this moment, we were alive. We were together. And for the first time in 5 years, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be all right. The journey to Denver took 2 weeks. We traveled in a convoy of wagons guarded by Henry's warriors and a detachment of federal marshals who had arrived 3 days after the battle. Word of the confrontation had spread quickly, carried by telegraph and newspaper, and the territorial governor had dispatched men to ensure that Edmund Blackwell reached trial alive. Edmund rode in a prison wagon, his hands chained his fine clothes, replaced by rough prison garb. The silver-haired king of Colorado's mining industry had become just another criminal awaiting judgment. But even in chains, his eyes burned with defiance, and I knew the fight was not over yet. Maggie rode in a separate wagon, the leather notebook never leaving her possession. She had sewn it into a hidden pocket in her coat close to her heart, where Edmund's men could not take it even if they tried. Beside her sat Victor Ashford, his leg wound bandaged, but healing his mind clearer than it had been in years. The confession Victor had written was tucked safely in a marshal's saddlebag, along with copies that had already been sent to 3 different newspapers in case anything happened on the journey. Edmund's threats about his connections, his money, his influence, meant nothing now. The truth was outspreading like wildfire across the territory. I rode at the front of the convoy, Old Thunder across my saddle, my eyes constantly scanning the horizon. I did not trust Edmund's remaining allies to let their master reach Denver without attempting a rescue. Every shadow could hide an ambush. Every ridge could conceal a sniper. But the attack never came. Perhaps Edmund's network had collapsed faster than anyone expected. Perhaps his former allies had decided to distance themselves from a sinking ship. Or perhaps they were simply waiting for the trial, hoping that money and corruption could still save their master. Whatever the reason, the convoy reached Denver without incident on a cold November morning, exactly 5 years and 2 days after the massacre at St. Catherine's Mission. The trial of Edmund Blackwell began on December 15, 1878, in the federal courthouse in Denver. The courtroom was packed every day, filled with reporters from newspapers across the country, curious citizens, and representatives from a dozen organizations that had been affected by Edmund's crimes. The Cheyenne sent observers, as did the Catholic Church. Even the territorial governor attended the opening arguments, his presence a signal that the powers of Colorado were taking this case seriously. Edmund had hired the best lawyers money could buy, a team of 3 men who had never lost a case in territorial court. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the notebook could have been forged, that Victor's testimony was the ravings of a man whose mind had been destroyed by injury. But the prosecution had something stronger than expensive lawyers. They had the truth. Maggie was the first major witness called. She took the stand on the 3rd day of the trial, wearing a simple blue dress that Rachel had helped her choose, her hair pinned back from her face. She looked nothing like the broken woman who had stumbled down the mountainside 3 months earlier. She looked strong, composed, ready. The prosecutor, a man named William Hartley, who had made his reputation fighting railroad corruption, led her through her testimony with careful precision. She told the court about the night of the massacre, about the flames and the screaming and the bodies of the people she had loved. She described being pulled from the burning chapel by me, a man who risked his life to save her. She recounted the years that followed her struggle to find peace in the convent, her belief that the tragedy had been a terrible accident. And then she told them about Edmund. She described his visit to St. Clare's convent, his false charity, his midnight appearance at her cell door. She described the kidnapping, the 4 months of imprisonment, the systematic torture designed to break her will and extract information. She showed the court her scars, the burn marks on her arms, the faded welts on her back, the marks around her throat where hands had squeezed until she nearly died. When she described her escape, the 9-day journey through the wilderness, the desperate hope that had driven her to find the one man who might help her, several people in the gallery were openly weeping. Edmund's lawyers tried to discredit her. They suggested she was mentally unstable, traumatized, prone to fantasy. They implied that she had fabricated the notebook herself, that she was seeking revenge for imagined wrongs. Maggie answered every attack with calm dignity. "I am not seeking revenge," she said. "I am seeking justice. For Mother Superior Clare, who was shot while protecting children. For Sister Ruth and Sister Anne and all the others who died that night. For the orphans who never had a chance to grow up. For the families who lost everything because one man wanted silver." She looked directly at Edmund as she spoke her final words. "I am not afraid of you anymore, Mr. Blackwell. You took everything from me once. My home, my family, my faith in the goodness of the world. But you could not take my soul, and now the world will know what you are." Victor Ashford testified the next day. His appearance caused a sensation. The former Army colonel, believed dead for 3 years, walking into the courtroom on his own 2 feet, his mind restored, his memory intact. He wore his old uniform cleaned and pressed the medals he had earned in earlier service gleaming on his chest. His testimony was devastating. He described the meeting with Edmund before the massacre, the false intelligence report, the money that had changed hands. He admitted his own guilt, his failure to question orders that his instincts told him were wrong. He wept when he described what he had seen that night, the horror of realizing too late what they had done. "I cannot bring back the people who died," Victor said, his voice cracking. "I cannot undo what I did, but I can tell the truth. I can make sure the world knows that Edmund Blackwell planned and paid for the murder of 23 innocent people, including women and children, so that he could steal their land." He pulled out a document and held it up for the court to see. "This is a receipt," he said, "signed by Blackwell himself, acknowledging payment of $1,000 to me for, and I quote, services rendered in the clearance of the St. Catherine's property. I kept it hidden all these years, not knowing why. Now I know it was meant for this moment." The receipt was entered into evidence, and Edmund's lawyers had no answer for it. "I testified on the 6th day. I told the court about my role as a scout, about the intelligence I had received, about my growing unease as we approached the mission. I described the moment of realization, the desperate attempt to stop the attack, the horror of seeing innocent people die because of information I had trusted. For 5 years I believed I was a murderer, I said. I hid from the world because I could not bear the weight of what I had done. But now I know the truth. I was a weapon, and Edmund Blackwell was the hand that aimed me. The blood of those 23 people is on his hands, not mine. I looked at the jury, 12 men who held Edmund's fate in their hands. I am not asking for vengeance. I am asking for justice, for the dead who cannot speak for themselves, for the survivors who have lived with this pain for 5 years, and for the future, so that men like Blackwell cannot do this again. The trial lasted 2 weeks. On December 29, 1878, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. Guilty on 23 counts of murder. Guilty on charges of conspiracy, fraud, bribery, and kidnapping. Guilty on every charge the prosecution had brought. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Spectators cheered and wept. Edmund sat frozen in his chair, unable to comprehend that his money and power had finally failed him. The judge, a stern man named Harold Morrison, who had presided over some of the territory's most difficult cases, called for order. When the room was finally quiet, he addressed the convicted man. "Edmund Blackwell, you have been found guilty of crimes that shock the conscience of this court. You orchestrated the murder of innocent people for personal gain. You corrupted officials sworn to uphold the law. You tortured a woman of God and attempted to murder witnesses to your crimes." The judge's voice hardened. "There is only one sentence appropriate for such evil. You will be hanged by the neck until dead, sentenced to be carried out on February 1, 1879. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none to give." The execution took place on a gray winter morning, with snow falling softly on the prison yard. I did not attend. Neither did Maggie. We had seen enough death, and watching Edmund die would not bring back the people we had lost. But Henry was there, along with Joseph and Rachel, representing the Cheyenne who had suffered under Edmund's greed. They watched in silence as the trapdoor opened, and justice was finally served. "It is done," Henry said afterward. "The spirits of my people can rest easier now." Rachel's eyes were distant. "It does not bring back the elders he killed. It does not restore the land he stole." Henry put his hand on his sister's shoulder. "No, but it proves that even the powerful can be held accountable. That is something. Perhaps it is enough." In the weeks that followed, the aftermath of the trial rippled across Colorado and beyond. 3 judges were removed from the bench for accepting bribes from Edmund. 2 sheriffs were arrested and charged with conspiracy. A dozen businessmen who had profited from Edmund's crimes found themselves under investigation. Edmund's assets were seized by the federal government. His mining operations were shut down pending review. The land that had once belonged to St. Catherine's Mission was returned to the Catholic Church, which announced plans to build a memorial on the site. Most importantly, the 23 people who died that night were officially recognized as victims of murder, not casualties of an outlaw raid. Their names were read aloud in the Colorado Territorial Legislature, and a resolution was passed honoring their memory. Maggie attended the memorial service held at the site of the former mission. Snow covered the ground, but the burned foundations were still visible beneath the white scars on the earth that would never fully heal. She knelt in the ruins of the chapel where she had almost died and prayed for the souls of the departed. Mother Claire, Sister Ruth, Sister Anne, the children whose names she still remembered, whose faces still visited her in dreams. She prayed for them all, and for the first time since the massacre, she felt something like peace. I found her there as the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose. "The church is going to rebuild," I said quietly. "Not a mission this time. A school for children of all backgrounds, native and settler alike. They are naming it the Claire Stone Academy." Maggie smiled through her tears. She would have liked that. Mother Claire always said that education was the greatest gift we could give. There was a pause. "They have asked if you would help. As a teacher." when it opens." Maggie was silent for a long moment, looking at the ruins of the place that had once been her home. Then she shook her head. "No, that part of my life is over. I cannot go back to who I was before." "Then who will you be?" She turned to face me, and in the fading light her green eyes were bright with something new. Not hope exactly, but something stronger, something more enduring. "I do not know yet, but I know I do not want to find out alone." I stood very still, hardly daring to breathe. I was not good with words, had never been good with words, but I knew what she was asking, and I knew what I wanted to answer. "You do not have to be alone, if you do not want to. Is that a proposal, Mr. Hartford?" I almost smiled. "I suppose it is, Miss Stone, though I warn you I am not much of a catch. A hermit with a bad reputation and a cabin on a mountain." Maggie reached out and took my hand the same way she had taken it 5 years ago in the snow outside the burning chapel. "You are the man who saved my life twice, the man who fought an army to protect me, the man who helped bring justice to the people I loved. I cannot imagine a better catch than that." Then yes. We were married in the spring of 1879 in a small ceremony in White River Valley. Henry stood as my witness. Rachel served as Maggie's attendant, weaving wildflowers into her hair. Joseph, Matthew, and Benjamin were there along with a dozen other warriors who had fought beside us. Victor Ashford attended as well, his leg healed but his soul still wounded. He had declined to return to his old life, choosing instead to remain with the Cheyenne who had cared for him during his years of madness. He would spend the rest of his days helping to build bridges between the native peoples and the settlers, a small act of penance for the wrongs he could never fully undo. The ceremony was simple, a blend of Christian and Cheyenne traditions. Maggie wore a white dress that Rachel had helped her make, and she carried the silver cross that had belonged to Mother Clare, the cross that had helped restore Victor's memory and seal Edmund's fate. When the vows were spoken and the blessings given, I kissed my bride under a clear blue sky with the mountains standing witness to our union. We returned to the cabin on Thunder Peak, but it was no longer a hermit's refuge. It was a home. I built a second room, then a third. Maggie planted a garden and brought in chickens and a milk cow. We were not rich, would never be rich, but we had enough. More than enough. The first year was an adjustment. I had lived alone for so long that I had forgotten how to share a space, how to consider another person's needs and rhythms. Maggie had spent her adult life in the strict routine of convent life and had to learn a different kind of discipline, the discipline of building a life from nothing in the wilderness. But we learned. We grew. We became partners in the truest sense, two people who had walked through fire and found each other on the other side. Henry visited often, bringing news from the valley and the wider world. Rachel came too, and she and Maggie would spend hours talking, rebuilding the friendship that had begun years ago in the mission school. In the second year of our marriage, Maggie gave birth to a daughter. We named her Claire after the woman who had shaped Maggie's faith and whose memory had guided her through the darkest times. Little Claire had her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and she brought a joy to the cabin on Thunder Peak that neither Maggie nor I had dared to hope for. Watching Maggie hold our daughter for the first time, I felt something break loose in my chest, something that had been frozen since the night of the massacre. I wept for the first time in years, and they were not tears of grief. Cole's voice grew soft as he reached this part of the story, and James leaned forward, hanging on every word. "Your mother was born in 1880, James. We named her Claire after the woman who saved your grandmother's soul. She grew up on this mountain, learning to track and hunt from me, learning to read and pray from your grandmother. When she was 18, she went to Denver to study nursing, and there she met your father." He paused, looking at the photograph on the mantelpiece. "Your grandmother never stopped being a woman of faith. She taught Sunday school in the valley for 20 years, helped establish 3 churches and 2 schools. She ministered to the sick and the dying, native and settler alike. She never forgot what Mother Clare had taught her, that true faith is measured not in prayers but in service." "What happened to the others?" James asked. "Henry, Rachel, Colonel Ashford." Henry lived to be 72. He became a leader among his people, helped negotiate treaties, fought for their rights until the day he died. Rachel married a man from the Arapaho tribe and had 6 children. She learned to write English well enough for letters, and she and your grandmother corresponded until the end. Cole's voice grew quieter. Victor died in 1885, 6 years after the trial. He never forgave himself, never found the peace he was looking for, but he tried. He spent his last years helping the Cheyenne, teaching their children, building schools and hospitals. When he died, they buried him in their sacred ground, an honor they had never given to a white man before. There was a long silence. Then James asked carefully, "What about you and grandmother? How did she? When did she?" The old man's eyes glistened, but his voice remained steady. "Your grandmother passed in 1915, 3 years ago. She was 61 years old. A fever took her, quick and merciful. She went to sleep one night and simply did not wake." He touched the photograph gently, his weathered fingers tracing the outline of a face he still saw in his dreams. "We had 36 years together, James. 36 years of joy and sorrow, of struggles and triumphs, of building a life from the ashes of tragedy. It was not always easy. There were hard winters when we nearly starved, droughts when the garden failed, moments when the old darkness threatened to swallow one or both of us. But we faced everything together, and that made all the difference." "Do you regret anything, grandfather?" Cole considered the question for a long moment. "I regret that I could not save more people that night. I regret the years I wasted hiding on this mountain, running from my guilt instead of facing it. I regret every moment of pain that Margaret suffered because of Edmund." He paused. "But I do not regret the life we built. I do not regret loving her or being loved by her. And I do not regret standing up to Edmund even though it could have gotten us both killed. Some things are worth fighting for, James. Some things are worth dying for. Your grandmother taught me that." The fire had burned low, and outside the cabin the first gray light of dawn was creeping over the mountains. James would need to leave soon to catch his train, the train that would carry him toward a war that was grinding to its bloody conclusion, an ocean away. "Grandfather," James said slowly, "why did you tell me this story tonight? Why now, after all these years of silence?" Cole looked at his grandson, at the young face that would soon see horrors beyond imagination, and he chose his words carefully. "Because you are going to war, James, and war will test you in ways you cannot imagine. You will see death. You will deal death. You will do things that haunt you, and things will be done to you that scar your soul." He reached out and gripped James's shoulder. "When that happens, when the darkness closes in and you wonder if anything matters, I want you to remember this story. Remember that your grandmother walked through hell and emerged with her faith intact. Remember that I spent 5 years as a ghost and found my way back to the living. Remember that even the worst evil can be defeated and that justice, though slow, does come." His grip tightened. "But most of all, remember this. You are never alone. Even when it feels like the whole world has abandoned you, there is always someone who cares. Someone waiting for you to come home. Your mother is waiting. Your family is waiting. And somewhere I believe your grandmother is watching over you." Tears were streaming down James's face, but he did not wipe them away. "I will remember, grandfather. I promise." "Good. Now go. Your train will not wait, and you have a long journey ahead." James stood gathering his pack and his rifle. At the door he paused and looked back at the old man sitting by the dying fire. "Grandfather, thank you. For the story. For everything." Cole nodded, not trusting his voice to speak. James opened the door, and the cold mountain air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and snow. He stepped outside into the dawn of a new day and began his walk down the mountain. Cole sat alone in the cabin, listening to his grandson's footsteps fade into the distance. The fire crackled softly, and the photograph of Maggie seemed to glow in the early morning light. "I told him," Cole whispered to the empty room, to the memory of the woman he had loved for 36 years. "I told him everything. I hope it was enough." He closed his eyes, and for a moment he could almost hear her voice, gentle and warm as it had been in those last peaceful years. "It was enough, my love. It was more than enough." James Hartford survived the Great War. He returned to Colorado in 1919, changed by what he had seen, but not broken by it. He carried his grandfather's story with him through the trenches and the battles, through the gas attacks and the artillery barrages, through the darkest moments when death seemed certain and life seemed meaningless. In the worst times, he would close his eyes and remember Maggie walking through the wilderness, driven by nothing but hope and faith. He would remember Cole fighting an army to protect the woman he loved. He would remember that even the deepest darkness could not extinguish the human spirit. He came home a hero decorated for bravery. But the medals meant nothing to him. What mattered was that he had kept his promise. He had remembered. James became a doctor, dedicating his life to healing rather than harming. He established a medical practice in White River Valley, serving the Cheyenne and Arapaho communities that had stood with his grandfather so many years before. He married a woman named Elizabeth, had 3 children, and lived to see his grandchildren grow up in a world that was very different from the one his grandfather had known. Cole Hartford died in 1920 at the age of 79. He passed peacefully in his sleep in the cabin on Thunder Peak that he had built with his own hands more than 40 years earlier. James was with him at the end, holding his hand as the old man's breathing slowed and finally stopped. They found him the next morning with a smile on his face and Maggie's photograph clutched to his chest. Whatever he had seen in those final moments, it had brought him peace. They buried Cole beside Maggie on a hillside overlooking the valley where they had fought their greatest battle. The headstone was simple, carved from local granite, with words that Maggie herself had chosen before she died. Cole Hartford, 1841 to 1920. Margaret Stone Hartford, 1853 to 1915. They found each other in the fire and built a heaven from the ashes. Henry's grandchildren came to the funeral along with Rachel's descendants and representatives from 3 Cheyenne tribes. The governor of Colorado sent a letter of condolence. Newspapers across the country published obituaries recounting the story of the mountain man and the nun who had brought down one of the most powerful criminals in the territory's history. But the most fitting tribute came from James himself. Standing at his grandfather's grave with the mountains rising around him and the wind whispering through the pines, he spoke words that Cole had taught him. "There are some journeys that are worth every step, no matter how hard the road. My grandfather walked a hard road from guilt to redemption, from solitude to love, from darkness to light. He taught me that no matter how far you fall, no matter how lost you become, there is always a way back. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, someone comes to find you in your wilderness and lead you home." He looked at the 2 graves side by side and smiled through his tears. "Rest now, grandfather, grandmother. You have earned your peace." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wildflowers from the valley below. Somewhere in the distance, an eagle cried out, circling on the mountain thermals. And on the hillside, where 2 people who had walked through fire were finally reunited, the sun broke through the clouds and painted the world in gold. The Clarestone Academy opened in 1882 on the site of the former St. Catherine's Mission. It served children of all backgrounds, native and settler, Catholic and Protestant, rich and poor. The school grew over the decades, adding buildings and programs, but it never lost sight of the vision that had inspired its creation. In the main hall hung a portrait of Mother Superior Clare, her kind face looking down on generations of students who passed through the doors. Beside it hung a plaque with the names of the 23 people who had died on that terrible night in 1873, along with a simple inscription, "In memory of those who were lost and in honor of those who fought for justice." The school still stands today, though it has changed much since those early years. The original buildings have been replaced, the curriculum updated, the student body grown to include thousands, but the mission remains the same: to educate, to uplift, to honor the memory of those who sacrificed so that others might learn. And in a small garden behind the main building, maintained by students as part of their service requirements, there is a statue of a woman in a simple dress. her hand extended to help a child who is reaching up to her. The plaque at the base reads, Margaret Stone Hartford, Teacher Healer, Survivor, 1853 to 1915. She walked through fire and emerged with her faith intact. Visitors to the school often pause at this statue drawn by something they cannot quite explain. Some say they feel a presence there, a warmth that has nothing to do with the sun. Others say they hear whispers on the wind, the voice of a woman who once taught children to read in a mission that no longer exists. Whether these stories are true, no one can say. But the students who pass the statue every day know one thing for certain. They are part of something larger than themselves, a legacy that stretches back more than a century to a time of tragedy and triumph of darkness and light. And in that knowledge, they find the same thing that Margaret Stone found on a mountainside in Colorado so many years ago: hope. The story of the mountain man and the giant nun has been told and retold over the years. It has been the subject of books and articles, documentaries, and films. But the truest version of the story is not found in any of these. It is found in the lives of those who came after. In every act of courage in the face of impossible odds, in every moment of love that triumphs over hate, in every person who walks through fire and emerges with their faith intact. The fire still burns, as it always has, but so does the light, and in the end, that is all that matters.